All right, well, a very warm welcome to everybody. Tonight we have our special guest speaker, Tom Mansfield, speaking on Jephthah. His reading is going to be Judges 11, and Matt's going to read that, but let's begin with a word of prayer. All right, so let's begin with our reading. As I said, Judges 11, and Matt's going to read that. Very much forward to Tom.
Thanks for having us. Me, not us. Apologies for being Finn. Finn needs to go to bed. He's very strict on that. He's a very conscientious boy. Now, Jamin hit me up for Bible class, and I said, yeah, I've got a topic. I've done one on Jephthah before. However, when I looked at it, it was mostly undone. So typically my first draft that I give is quite a lot to chew. I've tried to condense it as much as possible, but you are receiving a first draft. And the third thing to mention is it's sort of a controversial story. There's a lot of different opinions on it. You may disagree with any, not looking at you specifically, but I did happen to catch your eye. You may disagree with any point. That's fine. I still think that there is relevant messaging that we see throughout the story. Okay, so Jephthah is better known for the story of his daughter, and the conclusion is that his rash decision cost him his lineage and his only child. Yet, as we read the record, the narrator seems to keep pushing our attention towards virginity and lineage. It seems to indicate that this is the true tragedy of the story. I think it's clear that Jephthah isn't typically looked at as a man of good character. And while people do acknowledge he's listed in Hebrews 11, they often begin with the assumption that he sacrificed his daughter and then used this lens to interpret everything else that we're told about him. He was the son of a prostitute. He spent time among outcasts. So perhaps he was more accustomed to pagan practices. Or he was a rash man who didn't consider what God would actually want. And so the goal tonight is to take a fresh look at this man and the story about him. And I hope to show that Jephthah was a man of faith, with a deep understanding of God and what he had done for Israel. I also want to challenge the assumption that his daughter was killed, and suggest that the repeated emphasis on virginity and lineage provides the key to understanding the account. But I should also point out, when I first began studying the passage, I had the same bias. I couldn't see how anyone could justify his actions or claim anything other than his daughter was killed. But as I read the story a bit more carefully, there was a couple of questions that emerged that made me suspect maybe we need to look at it again. And the first question was, when Jephthah argues with the king of Ammon, why does he specifically reference Sihon and Balaam? Is there more to the story? The second question was, Jephthah never tells his daughter what vow he had made. So how did she immediately understand the implications? How did she know what was going to happen to her? And if she thought she was about to die, it seems like a strange response to go 2 months into the hills and mourn your virginity. And so that's sort of where I started. And we're going to now dive a bit deeper. Let's look at chapter 10 to get some context for this man. So for 18 years, the end of chapter 10, 18 years, the Ammonites oppress Israel. I should also point out, Ammonites is this chapter. We're going to be referencing the Amorites, who are much earlier, and I'm definitely going to confuse the two, so just read on. The Amorites oppressed Israel. Israel was crushed and severely distressed, and yet, verse 16, they put away their idols so that God becomes impatient over their misery. The King James says, God's soul was grieved for the misery that Israel were under. And so when Ammon assembles to fight, Gilead turns to Jephthah, described in chapter 11, verse 1 as a mighty warrior. Now that expression is the same that's used of Gideon and of David. So it's not just a skilled fighter. It describes someone who's a capable leader, a man of courage and proven strength. We also learn in the early verses that he was the son of a prostitute, and as such, he was driven away by his family. And he goes to a place called Tob. And like David, he gathers around him a group of men. And like David again, verse 3, we're told that they're worthless fellows. And these men went out with him. And this idea is the language associated with raiding or military activity. So when Gilead needs a deliverer, the elders know exactly where to go. Who else is more qualified than this man, Jephthah? And so in verse 9, Jephthah agrees. If you will bring me home again to fight against the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, I will be your head. So that phrase there, give them over to me, is significant. It's the exact same language that is used when God gives the enemies of Israel into their hands and he grants them possession of the land. So from the outset, Jephthah frames this conflict in the vocabulary of God's past deliverances. So that brings us to verse 11. He goes with the elders, and at Mizpah, he begins leadership of the army. Now, I think that there's a very strange start. For a man who is described as being a mighty warrior, his first move isn't to attack, but it's diplomacy. He seeks peace. Look at what it says. He sends messengers to the king of Ammon, and he says, what is there between you and me that you have come against my land? And the king of Ammon replies and says, well, you guys took my land when you came from Egypt, and now therefore I want it back. Well, this is not true. And so in response to his distorted history, Jephthah gives a careful retelling of Numbers 21 and Deuteronomy 2. So what's the history? How did Israel come about owning this patch of land that they were fighting over? Israel requested peaceful passage through the Amorite territory. The king, Sihon, refused and he attacked. And so the God of Israel gave Sihon into Israel's hand. That's the exact same phrase that we see Jephthah already using, given into my hand. Israel didn't seize Amorite land. They possessed the land of the Amorites, whom God dispossessed. I think it's interesting to note the way that Jephthah goes about it. He follows the diplomacy of Moses. In Deuteronomy 2, verse 26, we're told that Moses sent messengers to Sihon with words of peace. And again, the key phrase appears. God gave, in Deuteronomy, God gave Sihon into Israel's hand. And so the argument from Jephthah is, no, the possession of this land was the result of divine judgment. It was a divine gift. And so Jephthah concludes in verse 27, the Lord, the judge, decide this day between the people of Israel and the people of Ammon. The wording that he uses shows that it's not just a statement about who is right. It's an appeal for divine verdict. God, the judge, will judge this day. But God had already judged the Amorites. Their idolatry and their abominations had brought judgment, and he cast them out before Israel. And so Jephthah entrusts the present dispute of the same land to the same divine judge. And ironically, just like the Amorites from Numbers 21, Ammon doesn't respond to the message of peace. Instead, in verse 28, they prepare for war. So, what have we seen so far about this man? Well, he's a man who appears to be steeped in the history of his people, a man who understands God's past judgments and his deliverance. And he believes that God will again give victory And on that basis, he is prepared to face a superior army. He's prepared to go up against the Ammonites. And so verse 29, we're told that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. This is a reoccurring phrase in the Judges for the person that is chosen to be the judge. And so he gathers an army and he marches from Mizpah to confront the Amorite army. And it's at this moment, just after we're told the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, with the history of Israel in his mind, with the battle before him, that Jephthah makes his infamous vow. Verse 30, he says to God, "If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from my doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Amorites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering." And so he makes this vow, he crosses over to fight, and the record immediately tells us the result. Verse 32, "And the Lord gave them into his hand." And so he returns home. If he had returned home and a cow had been the first thing to come out of his door, or the first thing to meet him, and he offered it as a burnt offering, there'd be no controversy about this vow. We would say that seems fine, that seems appropriate. But we know what happens. Verse 34, Jephthah came home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him. So because we read the story knowing the outcome, we tend to judge the vow in hindsight. We look at the vow in the context of apparently his daughter being put to death. And yet it's worth pausing to reconcile this moment, this vow moment, with the picture that we've already been given or we've seen of Jephthah. Why? Why would he make this vow? What mindset led to this vow? And is this the rash decision of a faithless man? Well, the first thing to point out is that it's interesting that Gideon doesn't receive the same judgment from Bible readers. Gideon had the Spirit of God, and yet he asked twice for God to give confirming signs with the fleece. But when we come to Jephthah, we often view his request to God in a far more negative light. He'd already received the Spirit. Why didn't he have faith? Why did he ask God to confirm it? Why did he offer this vow? So let's just slow down and consider some important observations about the vow. I believe that this moment, this vow, this moment right before going to battle is tied to his inclusion in Hebrews 11. In Hebrews 11, we're given sort of a random list of people and then a random list of faithful activities they did. And it seems to be the most fitting that through faith, Jephthah put foreign armies to flight. That language fits in Judges 11 verse 33 when he strikes Ammon with a great blow and they flee from him. So immediately following his vow, Jephthah acts in a very faithful way. He defeats the enemy, and this is the reason he is in Hebrews 11. The other interesting thing to note from Hebrews 11, verse 38, it says, all of these people, Jephthah included, died in faith, not having received the promises. And so it tells us that all of these people in Hebrews 11, including Jephthah, their faith was based on the certainty that God would bring about his promise. So what promise did Jephthah have in his mind that gave him certainty? Well, it was the promise to Abraham that they would receive land and blessing and everlasting inheritance in this area. It's also important to note that his faith predates the vow that he gives. In his message to Ammon, he declares that the Lord, the judge, will decide between Israel and Ammon. He's not just recounting history, but he's confidently assessing that God has already judged between Abraham and Canaan. And so he's confident and faithful that God would establish their inheritance now, that God would give them this land. The third thing to look is the wording here more reflects a covenant language rather than bargaining. It's not a kid arguing against their parents. If you give them into my hand, is what he says to God. And we've already looked at this. This is the third use of this phrase. It describes how God gave the Amorites this exact parcel of land. And it's the end result of the covenant with Abraham. Genesis 15, we're told that Israel would be used to judge the iniquity of the Amorites. And this land that they're contesting about today, would be given to their seed. And the fourth thing, and perhaps the most important, is God answers using the same language. Verse 32. What does God do? God gives it into his hand. He gives the Ammonites into their hand. He mirrors Jephthah's request. And so we have this framing that the victory is a divine response. And it's also the same thing that God had done to the Amorites when Israel came out of Egypt. And so I don't think that the record is portraying an idolatrous or impulsive man. Instead, we see a man who has logic. His mind is shaped by history and a trust that God will deliver as he has done before. And so we need to ask, well, if he believed, if he had faith, what motivates this vow? It's also important to note that Jephthah's vow isn't without precedent. This sort of, if you do this, I will do this. I don't think he's copying Jacob, but there are striking similarities between Genesis 28 and verse 20. Jacob says to God, if God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And he ends, and of all that you give me, I will give 1/10 to you. And so the context here is he's just received the covenant promises. He's just seen the latter vision. And so after all of that, Jacob vows, I've put a period in the wrong stop here. But in both cases, the vow is offered in the context of the covenant promises to Abraham. It's the immediate context of Jacob's vow, and it seems to be the mindset that Jephthah has in his vow. So Jacob's just been assured that the land and the blessings that were given to Abraham would continue through to his line. And Jephthah, well, he stands on this same promise of faith. He believes that God would preserve Abraham's seed and would secure the land that he had promised them. And even look at the similarities of wording. Jacob says, if God does the following, if God preserves him, if God provides for him, and if he brings him home in peace, then God will be his God, and Jacob would give back to him. So although Jacob's context isn't warfare, there's clear parallels to Jephthah. Both men are facing uncertain futures. Both are seeking God's provision. Both promise to give back to God if they return home in peace. That word's the same. And Jacob here, he promises 1/10 of what God gives him. And Jephthah promises something from his own house. None of us have a problem with what Jacob offered. So the question is, why this vow, Jephthah? Why this form of dedication? Verse 31 states, whatever comes from the doors of my house shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, you might think I'm pulling at straws here a little bit, but let's just save that till later. So he says, whatever comes out from my house will be the Lord's, and I'll offer it up for a burnt offering. The Hebrew word end there can function as or, depending on the context. Exodus 21 verse 15 says, whoever strikes his father or mother. And so I'm not saying that this proves it. I'm saying it fits the framework of Jephthah's thinking. So I believe his vow is this. If God gives Ammon into our hand, whatever comes out from our house shall belong to the Lord, or I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Now, how does that help? And why these two possibilities? Well, I believe Jephthah gives these two offerings because they reflect two historical patterns that appear to be shaping his thinking. So we've already seen that Jephthah echoes the language used when God gave the Amorites into his hand. And if you turn to Deuteronomy 2 verse 34, you'll see Israel's response to God's promise. So God promises, I will give these people into your hands. And what does Israel decide to do? They decide to devote the cities and the people to God. And if you turn over the page, Deuteronomy 3 verse 6, it says they did the same to Og in the same way they did it to the king of Sidon. They devoted the people to God. In Joshua 10, don't turn there, but we're given 6 cities of the Amorites that were devoted to the Lord for destruction. And so it was an act of dedication in response to being delivered. Israel, in gratitude, says, for giving us these lands, for giving us all of this, we are going to devote these cities to destruction. And we know this happened again. It was commanded in Ai and Jericho. Jephthah couldn't devote Ammonite cities because we're told in Deuteronomy 2 verse 19, Israel wasn't allowed to take this land. God hadn't given the land of the Ammonites to them. And so instead, Jephthah promises to devote something from his own house. So is that clear? He's copying what Israel has done. He's devoting something to God out of gratitude for what God is going to do for him. And the other historical moment that Jephthah references in his letter to the king is Balak, the king of Moab. Interesting to note is that the disputed land, the land that they're fighting about now, once belonged to Moab. In Numbers 21 verse 26, it says this land belonged to Moab and then the Amorites seized it. So if anyone was going to reclaim it, if anyone had cause to reclaim it, it was Moab. And yet in his letter to the king of Ammon, Jephthah says, but did Balak ever try and fight us for it? Did Balak ever try to take it off us? What did Balak do? Balak, the king of Moab, he hired Balaam to curse Israel. An interesting thing there, if you turn to Numbers 23, it's repeated 3 times. Each time that Balaam was asked to curse Israel, Balaam built 7 altars and offered 7 bulls and 7 rams. Numbers 21 verse 1 to 2, Numbers 23 verse 14, and Numbers 23 verse 29. So we're told 3 times that sacrifices were offered, and each time 14 bulls and rams were offered. And the interesting thing to note is that these animals were used for burnt offerings, obviously within the right context in the priestly tabernacle. And so 3 times God is given burnt offerings and turns the curse of Balaam into blessing. Jephthah knew that God had promised to Jephthah knew of God's promise to Abraham of blessing. And he also knew that once a foreign king and a prophet had offered extravagant burnt offerings in an attempt to overturn God's promise of blessing for Israel. But he failed. God preserved his covenant blessing. And I think this could explain the second part of the vow. So if God upholds his promise and he blesses us, Jephthah says, I will offer a burnt offering in gratitude. And so both aspects, this is the part that you can't argue with, both aspects of Jephthah's vow are linked to God keeping his covenant to Abraham. And both outcomes of his vow are in memorial of what had occurred when God had acted. So he gives devotion in response to victory, and he offers burnt offerings that recall God's covenant faithfulness. Now, if an animal had emerged, it would be given as a burnt offering. That's pretty obvious. But if a person emerged, there was no ability for them to be sacrificed. No priest would accept it. God certainly wouldn't accept it. But what could a person be? They could be devoted to the Lord. And so that's why I think he gives these two options. A burnt offering, or I will devote this person to the Lord. And so in faith he marches out to Ammon. And verse 32, the Lord gave them into his hand. This same language is repeated time and time again in this chapter. And it's framed as a direct answer to his request. Now, I'm not saying that God gives explicit approval of this vow, but I'm saying using this word, the Lord gave it into his hand, it presents Jephthah as a man acting in faith. He was confident in God's promise to give Israel his inheritance. And so now he returns home in peace. And now, just like Jacob, God has fulfilled what is asked of him, and it's Jephthah's turn to fulfill what he promised. And this brings us to sort of the sad part of the story. And there were several questions that I raised earlier that come into focus. The first question is, how did his daughter immediately understand what the vow would mean for her? Second thing is, she asked for 2 months, not to mourn her death, but her virginity. It's a very strange response. And the third, potentially odd thing is that the record doesn't describe a violent death. We know that Judges sort of seems to really enjoy telling us the details of violent death. So it's strange. Its absence is strange. And so as we read this section carefully, the narrative seems to press us towards a particular tragedy. Not death, but the tragedy is the end of Jephthah's lineage. Notice how she's introduced to us in verse 34. Behold, his daughter came out to meet him. She was his only child. And I think most of us are familiar with the concept of an only child, but the text reinforces it in case we didn't know. Beside her, he had neither son nor daughter. So it's reinforced, this is his only heir. And so understandably, when Jephthah realized that his only daughter is now the subject of the vow, Jephthah is devastated. Verse 35, he's distraught. He tears his clothes and he says, I have been brought very low. Why has he been brought low? I have opened my mouth to the Lord and cannot take back my vow. Now, a slight side note here. This gives us another picture of an obedient and faithful man. We know from Numbers 30 that if a man offers a vow to the Lord, he shall not break his word. And it uses the exact phrase that Jephthah says. He should do all that proceeds out of his mouth. And so even in the depth of despair about what this will mean for him, for his lineage and for his only daughter, we don't have an indication that Jephthah ever considers breaking his vow. He says, I have opened my mouth to God and I have to fulfill it. And so how did she know what was going to happen to her? As far as we can see from the record, no one tells her what Jephthah vowed. Well, consider what she can infer, what she knows. Her father is distraught. She knows that he's made a vow. She knows that wasn't the intended target, but now it involves her. And she knows that her father cannot do anything to get out of it. And I think the fact that she figures it out so quickly is further proof that this is a faithful family with a deep knowledge of their history and God's laws. So how does she figure it out? How does she know what's going to happen to her? Well, there's really only two vows that can be made in regards to other humans. And both of them are found in Leviticus 27. So turn there now. We'll have a little bit of a look at this. Leviticus 27 verse 2. This is the first vow that can be made on a person. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to the Lord involving the valuation of persons, then the valuation of that person is as follows, and then it continues on. As far as I know, we're never given an example of this vow being used. But essentially, it's the idea of, for whatever reason, dedicating another person to God and then redeeming them by paying the tabernacle the value that was assigned to them. So children were 5 shekels, men were 50. You offer them to God and then you redeem them by paying that amount. An example of this could be a mother who, during a difficult labor, vows that she will offer the child to God if he brings it into the world safely. And so the expectation from this chapter is that the child would then be redeemed. It carries the idea that although this life belongs to God, you acknowledge this by giving the value of the life to God and redeeming the child. You pay the 5 shekels and the child comes back to your life. And so likely his daughter rules out this option because his father wouldn't be distressed if all he had to do was pay 30 shekels to redeem her from his vow. And so the only other vow that could affect her was to be devoted to God. Turn to verse 28. But no devoted thing that a man devotes to the Lord of anything that he have, whether man or beast or inherited field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. Verse 29 adds that if something is devoted for destruction, it shall be put to death. And we've already looked at it. That language echoes the Amorites being devoted to destruction by Israel. It has the echo of Saul's failure to utterly destroy Amalek when God had devoted that city for judgment. But I could be wrong, but I think Jephthah's vow stops short of this. There's no indication that he devotes something from his house to destruction. Instead, he vows that whatever comes out, whatever meets him, will be devoted to God. So what does that mean, to be devoted to God? Well, I think it's important to notice that verse 28, it describes status, not necessarily outcome. So it says, whatever is devoted will become most holy to the Lord. It's only when something is explicitly devoted for destruction, death is required. And so where does that leave us with Jephthah's daughter? Well, Numbers 18 verse 14 uses this exact same language to describe what belongs to Aaron and his sons. Numbers 18 verse 14, he says to Aaron, every devoted thing in Israel shall be yours. That word devoted is the exact same. And so in this context, in Numbers 18, the priests received portions of things given to God. They received offerings, first fruits, and devoted things. And we know that fields were one of the things that could be devoted to God. If a field was devoted to God, if somebody said, hey, God, if you do this for me, I'm going to give you a field, I'll devote this field to you, we wouldn't automatically assume that the field is going to be killed, because that doesn't make any sense. Instead, what happens is it would pass from ordinary family possession, the inheritance of a family, and it would go into sacred possession. It would now become the inheritance of the priest. And so it's the same thing with a person. Devotion for a person does not automatically indicate death. Instead, it indicates transfer of ownership and status. So something that once belonged to a family, Jephthah's daughter, the only heir of Jephthah, now wholly belongs to God. So applied to a person, applied to Jephthah's daughter, devotion would mean that they no longer stand within the ordinary structure of family lineage and inheritance. Instead, they belong in a sacred domain administered by the priests. And the key phrase from Leviticus 27, verse 28, is that every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. So in effect, Jephthah's daughter becomes most holy. She is dedicated to God. She's not a part of Jephthah's family, but now she is a part of God. She's most holy to God. And that word is exactly what you think it is. It's used uniquely for things that belong to God, the most holy place, where a priest could only enter once a year under strict conditions. We know that offerings are called most holy, could only be eaten by priests in the holy place. We know that land set apart for priestly use in Ezekiel 45 is called most holy. And so in each case, the idea is the same. Something is removed from its common use and belongs now uniquely to God. And so I think that begins to explain why the narrative focuses so much on her virginity. Back in Judges, we're told 4 times. Verse 37, weep for my virginity. 38, so she wept for her virginity. Verse 39, she had never known a man. And verse 40, this is what the daughters of Israel seem to commemorate. And so the emphasis would be understandable if she died. While the emphasis would be understandable if she died, it's striking that the text doesn't dwell on her death. Instead, it goes, she was a virgin, she's not going to have a line. Instead, the Lord leads us towards another possibility. Perhaps, and I say perhaps, but I actually mean I think, I'm pretty sure that she lives out her life in perpetual holiness and service to God. She was removed from her ordinary life, from marriage, from children, from inheritance, and she was set apart for God. But if she belonged wholly to God, how would that look in practice? It sort of seems convenient for me to claim that, no, she just served at the temple, tabernacle, and that's just a nice little bow we can put on. But there's actually evidence of a group of women who were connected with the service of the tent of meeting. Exodus 38 verse 8 records that the basin in the most holy was made from the ministering women who ministered at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So that word ministered is the same word for Levitical duty, Numbers 4 verse 23. It's the same idea of the ministering of a Levite. And so it suggests that during the Exodus, there was a group, an organized role of women who ministered at the temple, the tabernacle. We don't really know much more about them, but we know that this group continues until the time of at least Samuel. 1 Samuel 2 verse 22, the sons of Eli abuse their position of power and they sleep with the women who served at the tent of meeting. So Jephthah is sort of right between these two references. And at a minimum, it shows that there was a recognized position where women served at the sanctuary. We're not just inventing this position out of nowhere. There were women who served at the tabernacle. But that still leaves the question, why this focus on loss of lineage and virginity? Why does wholly belonging to God lead to lifelong celibacy? We know that the scripture never requires this. However, we are told over and over that if you're going to be near God, if you're going to be serving God, they have to sanctify themselves. So in Sinai, Exodus 19, verse 15, the people were told to sanctify themselves and not go near a woman. In Leviticus 15, we're told that priestly service, so when you were serving, you required ritual purity. Sexual relations with them were not possible until they went home. And so it seems that there were long periods of service where the priests would remain celibate. But what if the separation was no longer temporary? What if there wasn't a 3-month period that you returned home afterwards? Jephthah's daughter, if she did go to the temple wholly belonging to God, she would never lose that consecrated status. She belonged wholly to God. She was most holy for the rest of her life. And so the text itself guides us. She mourns her virginity, and the narrator concludes she had never known a man. The grief isn't framed around her death, but around the loss of marriage, the loss of having children, and the continuation of her father's house. In Scripture, holiness removes something from common use. And so I would suggest for Jephthah's daughter, it removes her from ordinary family life. And her mourning, when she goes to the mountains, recognizes what lifelong consecration would mean. She belongs wholly to God, and therefore the future that she would naturally have expected, family, would be surrendered to him. And so to summarize, Jephthah is full of faith that God would bring about their victory over the Amorites. And his confidence is based off the fact that God would bring about his promises and had brought about his promises. And he recalls 2 events where God worked to bring about his promises. He records to the king of Ammon the story of Balak, and the story where God gives this land to the Amorites. And so he makes a vow that mimics those events. He devotes someone from his house, like Israel devoted the Amorites, because God had promised that he would give them into their hand. And he promises a burnt offering, which links to a time where burnt offerings were made, but God brought blessings rather than curses. And we've also seen that Scripture defines the tragedy of his daughter not by death, but by her virginity and the loss of lineage. And so it ends with her daughter returning willingly. The daughter returns from the mountains willingly so that Jephthah can carry out his vow. And I think, I've tried to frame it so you can see a link here to Genesis 22. We've got a covenant promise, a belief in that. We've got inheritance, we've got an only child, and we've got willingly surrendering to God. Genesis 22, Isaac is Abraham's beloved son. He's the only son. He's the promise that the seed would come through. The seed that the promise would come through. And yet God says, take this son, your only son, and offer him. And Abraham obeys because he too, like Jephthah, he believes that God will bring about his promise. And we have similar language, burnt offerings, we've got mountains, we've got the only child, and obviously we've got the willing surrender of Isaac onto the altar. In Christ, these echoes reach fulfillment. Isaac was spared. Jephthah's daughter was set apart. However, with Christ, the Father does not stay his hand. And so all of these ideas converge with Christ, the beloved Son, the only Son who was given, the one who was consecrated and set into the world, the one who comes saying, I've come to do your will, O God. And this man goes willingly, like a lamb led to the slaughter. But unlike Isaac, no substitute is provided for him. Unlike Jephthah's daughter, his life is required. But just like these stories, Christ believes in the promises. Just like Abraham and Jephthah, Christ believes that this will not lead to the end of his promise. He believes that he will be raised. And we know that through Christ's death, the covenant promises are not lost, but they have their fulfillment. The blessing now extends to all nations, and the inheritance is made certain. So, through Christ, you and I have been brought into the same promises that Jephthah believed in. We're being made part of Abraham's seed. And in baptism, we too made a vow to God. We were buried with Christ, and we were raised to belong to him. And we know that we're now set apart from the ordinary. We're devoted to God. Ephesians 2 describes us as being God's house. 1 Peter 2 says we are a holy priesthood. And 1 Corinthians 1 says that we are sanctified in Christ Jesus. We're set apart from the old way of life. We've surrendered to those things. And so our calling is to live as people who have opened our mouth to the Lord and cannot go back. Our calling is to be devoted to him in everyday life, in our every choices. Because we too, like Jephthah, like Abraham, like Christ, can trust that the inheritance that he has promised us is certain.